filmmaker and director Matthew Vaughn has recently come out with a very unpopular opinion, and Star Wars fans are not happy. To put it simply, and we'll get to his actual comments in a minute, he believes the Star Wars franchise should be rebooted. Now, this is a question that's come up before, especially in the context of talking about what Disney are going to do with Star Wars in the far future, well beyond the current spin-offs, beyond Disney+, beyond the upcoming films. What if they still own Lucasfilm in decades to come? Will they do a reboot of the original trilogy with the same characters but different actors for a new generation in a new style? Well, in my opinion, and from what I've seen on social media, many fans agree, Star Wars is one franchise that should never be rebooted. You can recast, do new stories with Luke, Han and Leia, but a full reset of the franchise, a big reboot, is a massive no. Reboots, rehashes, and sequels have been a staple of Hollywood for decades, and this is something fans criticize films and franchises for: lack of originality, afraid to take risks, and from the studio's perspective you can see why. Financially and in terms of profit, studios tend to see reboots as an easy win, ways of retelling a classic story in a modern style that reaches a new generation of viewers, and you might argue, to some extent, reboots can help straighten the continuity of complex franchises and breathe new life into them. That was the goal behind Fox's X-Men First Class reboot, and it's the real reason it's expected that Marvel Studios will reboot the MCU after Avengers Secret Wars. And director Matthew Vaughn, who's the one making these comments, is no stranger to reboots himself. He was the mastermind behind X-Men First Class, the film I just mentioned, one that did work in large part because of smart casting choices. But now he's spoken on the subject of the Star Wars franchise and criticised recent shows and thinks the best decision, the best move for the franchise going forward, is a full-on reboot. So here is his reasoning. He fell in love with the Star Wars original trilogy, and to him, nothing has worked as well ever since. He doesn't believe it's a good idea that Star Wars moves further away from the Skywalker family. He said, quote, "I want to see Luke Skywalker, I want to see Princess Leia, Han Solo and Chewie doing their thing. Not some distant cousin. Who cares?" he says. Now this is a deliberate criticism of the Star Wars sequel trilogy, where Daisy Ridley's Rey became a Skywalker by virtue of deciding to take on the name. And he doesn't seem too big about Star Wars on the small screen, which has worked really well. I mean, sure, not every show's been perfect, but some of the best Star Wars content in recent years has been on Disney+, and the franchise wouldn't be as relevant after 2019 without the likes of The Mandalorian, Kenobi, Ahsoka, Andor, you name it. And so, Star Wars doing something different, being experimental, exploring different characters and worlds and stories is the best thing for the franchise. You don't have to stick with the original characters. And for the love of C-3PO, we don't need the franchise rebooted, not in my opinion. You might disagree, and if you do, let me know down below. I would love to hear the other side of this. Matthew Vaughn, talking to Josh Horowitz, said, quote, "For me, doing a Star Wars movie is to play with the characters that I loved. And to him, those characters have enough magic that if Disney were to reboot Star Wars, they could share those same stories with a new generation, in a new way." And this is where I really disagree, because I feel as though the original trilogy of films, episodes 4, 5 and 6, still hold up well to this day. The storytelling is fantastic, they made history with their visual and practical effects. The magic he talks about is still very much there, and just as they've done with Solo: A Star Wars Story, Luke in the Mandoverse, you can do more with these characters and recast, but we don't need a full-on reboot. And one of the things Matthew Vaughn does not realise is that Star Wars is a generational saga. As one writer, Thomas Bacon, said responding to this, it betrays a fundamental understanding of George's design, intention and vision of the Star Wars saga. The focus is always shifting from generation to generation, which is why if George had done his own sequel trilogy before he sold the rights to Disney, he even said that story was going to focus on the grandkids of the Skywalkers, a character called Kira, whose prototype ended up being Rey. Every generation has a legend: Luke, Anakin, Rey, and whoever else that is going to be set up in Sharmino Bechanoi's film, the 2026 Star Wars movie. As Mark Hamill recalls George Lucas telling him in 1976, eventually, if he ever were to write an episode 7, it would be Luke as an old man passing down the mantle in the same way Obi-Wan did to Luke in A New Hope. Disney's own treatments of 7, 8 and 9 kind of discarded a lot of what George wrote, but they did adapt some elements too. So it's constantly cyclical, it's always moving forward, not backwards. As much as we love the original trilogy, to say the entire franchise, every show, every movie, everything should focus on Luke, Leia, Han and Chewie is simply missing the point of the Star Wars story, of heroism and passing on what you've learned. As aforementioned, it's intergenerational. And listen, it's absolutely fair to say you want more Luke, you want more Leia and Han, and you want them to be involved in Dave Filoni's Star Wars film, The Fight Against Thrawn, the canon adaptation of Heir to the Empire, but to say that all of Star Wars in its entirety should focus on this time period and these characters is limiting and hindering the franchise. And it seems at long last, Star Wars is moving away from nostalgia, or at least doesn't rely on it as much as they did. They still do it quite a lot in shows like Ahsoka, but that's a show that calls for fan service. But if you think of Star Wars Andor, Skeleton Crew coming up, and The Acolyte, they're shows exploring either new themes or different points in the timeline, and don't rely on the Skywalkers. I mentioned The Acolytes, but also other High Republic projects, the books, as well as kids' television such as Young Jedi Adventures. They're moving Star Wars in new and exciting directions. They've worked out that nostalgia has its place, however, an ever-developing franchise cannot simply rely on it. Disney, with their first Star Wars movie, The Force Awakens, did play it quite safe. They repeated familiar character beats, concepts and tropes, attempting to tell a classic tale in a fresh way, and it did have a staggering box office success. However, critics at the time did say the only issue with the film is that it feels as though it's a reboot, a retelling in its own right of A New Hope. So imagine if they did a full reboot, going back to square one. I can't imagine fans are going to be too happy about it. And The Rise of Skywalker is proof. They decided to bring Emperor Palpatine back for the final installment of the Skywalker saga, and fans weren't impressed. And the more you rehash classic characters, the more you dilute them. Mark Hamill recently said the same thing when asked if he'd return in Charmin Obaid-Chinoy's film as Luke Skywalker's Force Ghost. But you could argue that since Episode 9, Lucasfilm has been much smarter with the way they make creative choices. There are still a ton of cameos and Easter eggs and references, but they're being more blatant while trying to move the needle. And to my mind, when these characters do show up, they seem better placed. The Book of Boba Fett is a great example of this. The return of Cad Bane was poetic. We got to see what Luke is doing post-Return of the Jedi. The Ahsoka show was a near-perfect blend of the familiar with brand new concepts, with its heroes travelling the pathway to Peridia, a fantastic new addition to the canon, introducing a brand new galaxy. Andor, in my opinion, did this the best. They used characters that we know from Rogue One and other parts of the Star Wars universe, but submerged them into what feels like a huge world, new worlds, new planets, and a new story. Some of the best Disney Star Wars characters came out of Tony Gilroy's show. It doesn't rely on any nostalgia, just fantastic writing, a brilliant story, which will connect to Rogue One after Season 2, creating a dark spy thriller drama. Matthew Vaughn's idea, if implemented, would reverse all of this, turning Star Wars into nothing more than a nostalgia fix. The original trilogy is the foundation of Star Wars, but it had its place. It shouldn't be rebooted or changed. Every generation has their own Skywalker and their own stories, and moving forward is respecting what came before and building on it. We just don't need a Star Wars reboot. But what do you guys think? Do you agree with Matthew? Do you disagree? Let me know your thoughts down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give me a big fat thumbs up, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next video.